What's up guys, and welcome to the channel. My name is Taryn Collins, and today I'm going to show you how I made this liner lock folding knife. It has mammoth tooth scales, zirconium bolsters, clip and back spacer, and then a Damascus blade. This one is actually called Damastil. It's a Damacor blade. So it turned out pretty awesome, I think, and I'm excited to show you guys how I did it. This is my first time making YouTube content, and I think it shows, but hopefully you guys can stick with me and get something out of it and enjoy watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. So this is the materials that we're starting with. I didn't show, obviously, cutting out this blade or milling the pockets and anything, but we'll show you that in another video. There's the tooth, the mammoth tooth that we used, and the liner, and then the blades. That's kind of the main materials, but let's jump into it and talk about how these work.
This part of the liner kind of flips in, it holds the blade open. Okay, that's the general mechanics. You can see on this one, because it doesn't have scales, most of these knives like this one will be covered with some kind of cool material as the scale or the bolster that we call it. But essentially what that means, you'll see that hole right there. There's a little ball in there called the detent ball, and that rides against the blade when it closes, and then it snaps into this. You'll see that hole right there. Can they see it? That little hole right there, that's a hole in the blade that lines up with that little ceramic ball and holds the blade so it just doesn't fall open. This is how your knives stay closed and don't cut you in your pocket.
Here I'm drilling the through holes on the lock side so the screws can slide through and screw to the other side of the knife. This is the countersink that allows us to get those screws nice and flush when we put the scales on. You can see we're getting pretty close right there, just a little bit more and we'll have it. Then make sure and drop your $50 carbide countersink bit and go ahead and put in a number 15 drill bit. This is just an undersized from a 3/16 size bit, and once we drill this out with this undersized bit, we'll then take a carbide reamer and ream this to a perfectly round hole, which improves the action of a knife. Obviously the pivot is a very important part of the knife. If you don't understand that, then I really don't know what to tell you. So this is the reamer, just making everything nice and round. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to ream the blade. The blade is actually drilled before heat treat, and then after heat treat is when we ream it, and that's why we use a carbide reamer, because obviously this is hard still. And make sure we have that stop bar you can see behind there, because if that thing gets away from you, that's not good news. And back to the countersink, we're just going to take the burrs off the edge of those holes, and that allows us to get this next tool in, which is a counterbore. This is what we use to create the pockets for the bearings. So we have ceramic bearings on these knives, which allows the blade to run very smooth, and this just creates a space for those so that they'll sit inside the knife and not get out of place. You'll see those a little bit later.
So now we've got the blade in place, and we're using the same carbide counterbore again to put a pocket in the blade just like we did in the liners, and that's just going to allow the bearings to fit in between the liner and the blade here. So one thing I forgot to do is throw this blade in the surface grinder and get it nice and flat. I usually do that prior to reaming and doing the pockets, because that ensures that we're referencing everything off a flat and parallel face. I measured this one and checked everything out, and luckily this time everything's nice and square and flat, because the blade came out of heat treat very square and parallel. This surface grinder is from Black Fox Knife Works, and it works great for me. It's not a huge unit, but it's easy to store and throw in when I need it.
Essentially what this surface grinder does, it allows you to attach it to your normal knife grinder, a 2x72 grinder, and then you can take the knife and put it on the magnet right there. So that's an electromagnet. Just turn that knob and it will suck the knife in very tightly and hold it, where you go and just run the knife across that wheel, and the platen is all parallel to that wheel, so as you run that back and forth, just advance very slowly, you're going to create a flat surface and make everything on the knife flat and parallel, which you'll hear me stress this entire time. Flat and parallel are paramount to making a folding knife to function. It doesn't rub the sides or get bound or not lock up straight. So just flip it over and then we'll go ahead and do the other side. Right here, I've already drilled the stop pin. I don't know, I just didn't film that, so bear with me, but you can see it right by the pivot pin, and we're just judging the right lockup. So I usually do my stop pin tracks a little bit undersized because you can always take more material off, but not put material back on. So we make it a little bit undersized, and I'm going to mark it right here. And the reason I mark it is because I'm a dum-dum, and I've had knives where I decided where I was going to mill or take a little bit off and then did it on the wrong side. So here you'll see me just with the carbide mill. I think that's 5/32, just taking that extra, just a hair of material off, and that allows us to test and get the knife locking up exactly where it should. Not the lockup, but it opens and stops where it's supposed to. So that pin stops the knife from obviously over traveling too far. So you have to have it in the right place, both closed and open. After we got that figured out, I'm going to go ahead here and mark on the blade where we're going to grind the lock face. So that bar right there, as you know, just slides right under the blade when it's open, and we have to mark on that blade where it's going to go. Another thing we have to do is mill this part of the bar thinner so that you're able to move it with your finger. These liners I think are 0.08 inches thick, so were you not to mill this, it would just be way too hard to move with your finger. It's hard to see, but we essentially mill it down to around 0.04. Then we're going to heat it up and bend this just a hair. So it's going to essentially bend about halfway the thickness of the knife blade. And that's going to cause it to, when the knife opens, this lock bar will spring into place and hold it open. Nice and steamy. Nice and out of focus too. Alright, so here we have the pin in place, a stop pin, so the blade is not touching the back spacer. And I'll show you how I made the back spacer later, but there's a gap between the knife blade and the back spacer. And we're going to hold it against that stop pin, and we're going to drill through the lock bar and then down a little bit into the blade. And what this does is creates a place for us to put a small 1/16 inch ceramic detent ball and line it up perfectly with the blade. That squeaking means we're getting into the hard blade, and that's a carbide bit, but it's a really small bit, and we just got to be real careful because those break easy. I'll try to show you in a second, but we're just drilling all the way through the titanium liner, and then we're going to drill about 1/16 of an inch, a little bit more than that. It really doesn't matter if you drill too deep into the knife blade, and if you look real close you can kind of see that little hole we made in the knife blade, and that's going to be where the detent ball sits in when the knife's closed. These are the detent balls. They're made out of ceramic. It just causes them to be very wear resistant and glide a little bit better than if they were still. So you just try your best not to drop them, because if you do they'll instantly go into another dimension. And then we take on this arbor press, and then this is a just feeler gauge with dials on it, and I think this one is at 0.016. That's usually what I'll do, 0.016 or 0.018. And then you go ahead and just press that detent ball into that hole. The hole is just drilled undersized, just smaller than the ball, so once you put in the arbor press you can kind of cram it down in there and it will stay stuck in there because it's wedged into the titanium. So you can kind of see here, there's that little hole we made when we drilled all the way through, and that's where the detent ball is going to land when the knife is closed and hold it from just falling open when you're carrying it around. That's why your knife doesn't just flop open. It's a pretty cool system. I think it was Michael Walker who invented it. He's one of the OGs of knife making, as well as Bob Terzuola, and I got a lot of my info from how to make knives from his book.
Alright, so here you can see that little scratch right there, if I can get it into the right light. But that's the little mark we made when the knife was closed and put together. So we're going to take and grind all the way up to that line. So you'll notice the blade is sitting on that janky old looking piece of micarta, but that is actually a specifically made wedge that holds the blade at the correct angle in relation to the face and curve of that grinding wheel, so we can grind that lock face at 8 degrees. This allows for the lock bar to lock up a little bit better and tighter without over travel. So you're going to see right there, we got to put it together and check to see where we're at, and you got to do this 2 or 3 times once you get good, and 20 or 30 times when you're first starting out, because if you do too much, then you got another problem on your hands of trying to fix a lock bar that doesn't lock up, and you do not want to go there. So we went to a finer grit belt here, and this is just a rinse and repeat process. You take a little bit off, you put the whole thing back together and check it until you get to the perfect lockup where it catches and locks up, but it doesn't go too far, and it catches enough that you have a solid lockup. So this is a very specific part you have to fine tune. Right there I'm just cleaning up that back side of the knife face so it looks good when you etch it.
Just finished grinding the lock face, did the detent, get more footage of that, but this is basically when a knife kind of comes alive, but it starts to function. We got our, let's see if I can see that, lock face, lock up right where we want it. It's about 30%, but that will wear a tiny bit. We're gonna carbonize it, but that'll wear a little bit to a little bit more of a lockup, but yeah. Pretty happy with that one so far. Blade's already centering without any adjustment, so should be a smooth build here on out.
So here I have the Mammoth 2 set on my Carbide Create Nomad Pro desktop mill, and this thing is an awesome machine, super precise, and I don't think a lot of people use it to mill some of these materials I do, but if you just take the right amount and don't try to get too crazy, it works fantastic. I even milled this zirconium, steel, everything with it, so it's an awesome machine, but it allows me to get everything kind of rough fit, and then I take and I put them onto the scales like I'm doing here and kind of get everything dialed in right to where it needs to be, so there's no gaps and everything fits smooth and looks good. So here I've got the scales fit to the liners and everything screwed on, and the screws ground flush. One thing that you have to take into account is you can see how that little detent ball kind of sticks out a little bit. It's kind of hard to see, but when that rides against the knife, it causes that lock bar to be pushed out against those scales. So right there where my finger's at, we have to mill a relief into both the mammoth tooth and the zirconium, so that that lock bar has somewhere to go when the knife's opening and closing. So just marking those areas a little bit with the fine tipped Sharpie marker here. Then we'll take it to the mill where we can make some space for it. So you'll see there's these tiny holes here at the site where the pivot pin goes through, and that just allows me to put these pieces back on the mill to get them milled. So once we finish with them on the mill, we can take and drill through the liner and through those marked holes to open up a space for that pivot pin to go in right there. So now that we drilled those holes out, we can take a counter bore and create some pockets for the pivot pin to sit in. Right here, you'll see me slowly realizing that I forgot to ream that hole out, and I got to just take that counter bore out, ream the hole out with a reamer, and now we can go ahead and just drill those pockets and create a flush space for the pins to sit in. So here you'll see those marks we made on the lock side scales for a pocket for the lock bar to go into when the knife's opening. So we got to mill that out now. You'll see that the mammoth tooth is a little bit thicker than the zirconium, and this looks a little bit better and makes it a little bit stronger, and we're going to go ahead and put a chamfer on that once we get everything kind of shaped and put together. So now that we got those pockets milled and these all fit up, we're putting them back onto the Nomad Pro to do some more shaping. The really nice thing about this setup I have is I made these custom plates for each model of knife I have, so I can take these off and put them back on in the exact same place and then reference those plates. So this allows me to take them off, fit them to the knife, do finishing work, put them back on for different operations, which is, for me, what really makes the big difference in having this be a useful thing and not just a gimmick. So here I am putting the zirconium bolsters back onto the plates for some contouring and final shaping. You can hear the screaming weasel going to town on the zirconium. Once you figure out the right depth and everything on this, it cuts it like butter. These clips sped up are always satisfying to watch. If you look close, you can see I accidentally milled the top of the screw off, which luckily that wasn't too deep because I've done that before, and if you mill the actual hole where the bit goes, it's a giant pain. We got everything fit and kind of rough shaped and put together, and it's starting to look a little bit more like the knife it's supposed to be. So you might think that we're almost done, but this is really just where the work begins, because now we got to do a lot of the finishing of each of these surfaces, the mammoth tooth, the zirconium. We got to hand sand the blade, we got to etch the blade, so still a lot of work left, but this is a fun part. I'm going to throw some tape on here so this mammoth tooth doesn't get too dinged up while I'm profiling the blade. So now that it's all together, we're going to take it back to the grinder and profile all the edges, because one of the features of most of my knives is they kind of flow and line up when the knife's closed and when it's open. So we gotta open it, close it, profile it, do all this stuff. So on to the next. So here what I'm doing is shaping the back spacer. I'm basically scalloping it or putting a design into it. There's no real function for this, but I really like how it looks, and I do this quite a bit in my knives. And essentially I'm just taking the back spacer, which is proud of the liners, and putting a groove, divot, I don't know what you call that, into it at evenly spaced intervals. So one of the things I like about making knives is it's essentially a functional art. So these have function, but they also look pretty cool. And part of the things that I like, or that are design aspects for me, is some of the textures and the feel of the knife. And this is something for me that really adds that to the build. It's more than just the color and the basic knife shape. It gives it a little bit more dynamic looks and feel to it. So I do it often. Some people hate it, some people like it. It's really just up to the person. So once we're done profiling all the curved parts of the knife, we switch back to the flat platen and start doing some of these flatter or convex parts of the knife that we can't do with the wheels. I like to do all the concave and curved parts first on the wheel, and then finish by doing the flat parts next, so it gives a cleaner transition in my opinion. Another thing we have to do is clean up the profile of the liner and the scales without the backspacer, and since we left that backspacer proud, we weren't able to clean up that area of the knife, so we have to do that with the blade out. And then this little front part is another spot we can't reach when the blade is in it, so we take and put the two knife halves together with these small flush screws, put all the scales on, and get all those flush and trim together at the same time.
So I think this is a good point to cut it off before this thing gets too long. So if you want to see how we get to this final product, then make sure to like, subscribe, all that jazz, and click on part 2 to see the rest of the build. Thanks for watching.